On this episode of China Uncensored, trade war tit for tat. Who says re-education is a bad thing? And finally, everyone sells out Taiwan. This is China Uncensored. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. There was an explosion on Thursday afternoon outside the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. According to the embassy, it was set off by one guy with a bomb, and he only injured himself. There's no word yet on what motive the 26-year-old bomber might have had, but one thing's clear. He didn't do a very good job of getting his point across. Beijing police are calling it an isolated security incident, which means you definitely should not try to look into it any further. But you know who the real threat is? Chinese citizens who attempt to share information with journalists. For example, this woman who's sharing photos and videos of the incident with journalists on WeChat. And now here she is being gently dragged away by plainclothes police in this video posted by AFP journalist Becky Davis. But don't worry, within a few hours, Chinese censors removed nearly all mentions of the explosion from Chinese social media. And that solves that. And anything you might have heard about some kind of vaccine scandal going on right now in China, ignore it. It's being totally overblown, according to Chinese state-run media. That's obviously why Chinese censors have purged the word vaccine from the entire Chinese internet. Because again, there's no story here. The editor-in-chief of my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, criticized the small number of people who aren't focusing on how well the government is doing in the face of the incident. Yeah, like these lame Chinese parents calling vaccine makers devils. 250,000 defective vaccines were given to children in China's Shandong province. Mistakes happen, right? The trade war between the US and China is in full swing, and the Chinese Communist Party is going tit for tat. President Trump announces $34 billion in tariffs. The Chinese Communist Party announces $34 billion in tariffs. Trump hits back with an additional $200 billion in tariffs. And the Chinese Communist Party hits back with, well, okay, $200 billion is more than China buys from the US, so they can't really match that. But they still want to hit the US back. That's why China's current $34 billion in tariffs aims to specifically punish American farmers. Not because the Chinese Communist Party hates farmers, but because US farmers tend to be Trump voters. The Communist Party may not have democracy, but they sure understand how it works. So, to counteract the effects of Chinese tariffs, Trump has announced $12 billion worth of subsidies. The size of the aid package is in line with the estimated $11 billion cost of the tariffs to American farmers. And guess what? The Chinese Communist Party has its own aid packages for Chinese companies hurt by US tariffs. That would be in addition to all the illegal subsidies the Communist Party already gives to Chinese companies. What this all means is both sides are hunkering down for a long trade war. In other trade war news, the US and EU are working on a trade deal. If the US and the EU do strike a deal, that would give them both more leverage to focus on trade disputes with China. As you can imagine, the Chinese regime is thrilled, especially after all the effort they made to get the EU on their side. Eat your heart out, Xi Jinping. Speaking of long protracted battles, Mark Zuckerberg has been trying to get Facebook into China for years. And frankly, it's gotten embarrassing. Whether it's his casual jog through the Beijing smog, or casually leaving a copy of Xi Jinping's book prominently on his desk when a Chinese official comes to visit, or casually asking Xi Jinping to name his firstborn child, well, it finally paid off. Facebook was given permission to open a subsidiary in China. It marks a huge breakthrough for the tech company. Wait, what's that, Shelley? It got shut down after one day. It turns out that Facebook had gotten permission from the local provincial government, but not from the Cyberspace Administration of China, which was like, no. It might be time for Mark Zuckerberg to realize that Xi Jinping is just not that into him. Wow, Xi Jinping and I actually agree on something. And be sure to follow China Uncensored on Facebook. Hey, that's not hypocritical. Hypocritical is Chinese state-run media running their own Facebook pages even while Facebook is banned in China. Speaking of state-run media, the Global Times has finally confirmed something we've already known for a long time. The Communist Party has opened re-education camps in Xinjiang. But according to the Global Times, those camps are a good thing. You see, Xinjiang in western China is home to the mostly Muslim Uyghur ethnic minority. And anytime the Chinese Communist Party, say, collects biometric data from millions of people there, or forces people to install software on their phones that monitors their text messages, and people complain about it, it's because they're Muslim extremists. And definitely not because they have legitimate privacy concerns. I mean, if you're not a terrorist, why would you care about privacy? That's why, if you complain, they put you in prison. As the Global Times puts it, extremists in prison need to transform their thoughts. We have invited experts on religion to rectify their extremist thinking. These extremists are told to repeat phrases like, "My soul is infected with serious diseases. There is no God. I don't believe in God. I believe in the Communist Party." Now you might think with Chinese Muslims being forced to abandon Allah for Xi Jinping thought, the Islamic leaders of the world would have something to say about it. Except they don't. Perhaps it's because many Muslim governments have strengthened their relationship with China or even gone out of their way to support China's persecution. The Chinese Communist Party gave a July 25th deadline to foreign airlines to stop listing Taiwan as a separate country/region on their websites, or else. But do you think airlines bowed down to that Orwellian nonsense? Yes, they did. But apparently, they didn't bow deeply enough. According to the Civil Aviation Administration of China, 40 out of 44 airlines have successfully complied with their wishes. The 4 airlines who didn't get 100% on their geography test, they were all American. You see, instead of listing Taipei as part of China, these airlines just took off the country designation, listing Taipei by itself. Well, Taipei, nothing. There was never anything else there, okay? But that's just not A+ work, according to the Chinese Communist Party. You see, these U.S. airlines have started to rectify the issue, but their rectification is still incomplete, which does not sound creepy and authoritarian at all. What will happen next? Well, the airlines get a 2-week extension, but China's Civil Aviation Administration will be paying close attention. After all, these U.S. airlines wouldn't want to be grounded, would they? Not only has the Chinese regime's pressure affected airlines, it's also pushed Taiwan out of hosting the kids' version of the Olympics, the East Asian Youth Games. That's so childish. Reportedly, it's because Taiwan wanted to change the banner of its official sports teams from Chinese Taipei to Taiwan. Unfortunately, this could set a dangerous precedent for Taiwan and democracy in general. It could make it very hard for Taiwan to ever host an international sporting event again. So don't hold out for the Taipei Olympics in 2036, unless Taipei is controlled by the Communist Party by then. Well, that's it for this week's uplifting headlines. What do you think? Leave your comments below. And before you go, now is the time when we answer a question from fans who support China Uncensored on the crowdfunding website Patreon. Joe Knox asks, Jiang Zemin, Toadmaster, will he ever be brought to justice? And what form or retribution would be appropriate? Good question, Joe. On the one hand, Jiang Zemin is a very old man, almost 92, and he's not in great health. As you can see, he can barely stand. And I can barely stand him. But I hope he lives long enough to see the day justice comes. But it's not just about bringing Jiang Zemin to justice. The entire faction tied to him is guilty of crimes against humanity, like the system he oversaw where Falun Gong practitioners, house Christians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs are killed for their organs in state-run hospitals. So justice demands more than just his head. The problem is, putting Jiang Zemin on trial will expose corruption so massive and deep within the Chinese Communist Party that it could bring the entire system down. Obviously, that's not going to be a popular move as long as the Communist Party stays in power. The party has never admitted wrongdoing for pretty much anything. Okay, they admitted that Chairman Mao was 30% wrong. But hey, he was still 70% right. I hope that what eventually happens is some communist equivalent of the Nuremberg trials. Those were the Nazi trials after World War II. Basically, the entire history of communism will need to be put on trial, with the world collectively deciding, you know what, 100 million dead people later, communism is probably not a good idea. Thanks for your question, Joe. And to everyone watching, remember, China Uncensored is made possible by support from viewers like you. So I'd like to ask you, if you can, contribute $1 or more per episode on our Patreon website, so we can keep uncensoring China. The link is below. Thanks for watching this episode. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time. Hey, if you haven't heard, we have a new podcast, China Unscripted. Myself, Shelley, and Matt, the producer, go into way more detail than we ever could on the show, which means more jokes too. So subscribe to us on iTunes. Once again, that's China Unscripted.